Okay.
Hello, everyone. As you know, we from time to time have conversations with different writers, artists, creative people, just chatting about the process and kind of their work. And I'm very happy to be joined with Matt Maxwell, who is a independent artist, or sorry, writer, independent writer who writes horror, fantasy novels. And in particular, you have a Kickstarter that is going on right now for
Yep.
All Waters Are Graves, a uh, now, let me ask. Okay, Hazeland novel, which
hmm
is
Hazeland's
horror.
the
No, sorry.
Hazeland is the series, the overarching series.
Yeah.
It's somewhere between fantasy and horror. There's some science fiction elements, but it doesn't read like, standard science fiction. It's pretty much its own thing. I mean, I can give you touchstones, and I think I have on the website, but those are pretty far ranging. So, I mean, it's safe to market it as fantasy or horror, but it may not be horrific enough for some, and it may be too horrific for others. This is the problem with working between genres.
Yes. Yeah. It is because on one end you get a little bit of both groups, but at the same time, there's some people that like a little bit more cream in their coffee, and some people that like a
Yep.
little bit more sugar.
The first comics project I wrote was a book called Strange Ways, which was horror and western. And you'd think, wow, okay, people like horror and people like westerns. I've had this whole big group to, two big groups to work from.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? It turns out actually that Western people don't like to have horror in their westerns, although it has made a resurgence now. Actually, it
Mhm.
seems to be very popular, especially in written fiction. But there's a bunch of horror western comics as well. And the horror people like, why are there cowboys with this werewolf? What is why I don't want to read this. So it's unfortunate, but
It is interesting because when you talk about genres, it seems like there are some genres that are more adhesive. They just pick up other
Mhm.
genres a little bit more easily. I would say horror, I think, falls in that category where the people that like horror, they can have horror, sci-fi, horror, fantasy,
Right.
horror, crime. And then the romance people, I think that tends to cross a lot of genres.
It
Uh,
does.
but weirdly enough, I think romance horror is probably something you don't see very often.
Yeah, we used to call them gothics, and
Yeah.
all the horror was, a lot of it was implied, a lot of it wasn't on the page. It was a sense of dread and foreboding, but it wasn't, the same thing as, say a splatterpunk,
Yeah.
novel. Or it didn't come out like, somebody like Cronenberg, who definitely, grapples with eroticism and horror
Hmm.
and body horror, but you wouldn't really call, Dead Ringers a romance,
Yeah.
probably.
Well,
Maybe if you're really weird.
yeah, and I wonder if part of it is due to the nature of romance, at least with modern audiences, there's that sort of very strict demand for a happily ever after.
Right. And
And
horror is definitely, in some ways, horror is a genre, at least as I see it, kind of, it's defined by emotional effect,
mhm.
and how you get that emotional effect can come from, many different ways, psychological, real life true crime, completely cosmic dread, but arriving at there's definitely a feeling that a horror novel usually imparts, or a work of horror fiction.
Yeah.
Um, at the same time, it's odd because a lot of the stuff that I grew up watching, like the Friday the 13th movies and Nightmare on Elm Street, is like there's a lot of humor in there too.
Yeah.
There's a lot of up and down. There's a lot of contrasting. It's like this is awful, but I'm laughing at it, and because it's almost a thrill ride and not as weighed down with seriousness, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, and I think, yeah, even with horror, even if you have sort of a quote unquote happy ending,
Oh yeah.
at what cost?
hmm
Like the
Yeah,
person is a shell at the end of it.
it's usually Pyrrhic victory. So that's,
Yeah.
I guess the term dark fantasy really has kind of fallen out of fashion.
Mhm.
It had a moment for a while, and then kind of, and I'm probably misremembering, but it seems like urban fantasy moved right in on that territory, and then it became a very staid, regular thing, which you know, all of Hazeland is set in Los Angeles. Los Angeles itself is a a character in the books, as any setting should be. But I would not call it urban horror in any way, shape, or form, simply because it doesn't have a lot of this. Urban horror. There's something that definitely comes to mind, and especially when it comes to agents and publishers, they have something that comes to mind when they hear an urban horror. Oh, it's an urban horror novel, but it doesn't have women with crossbows and tattoos and romance with vampires, werewolves, and or any other thing that goes bump in the night. So yeah.
Well, and I don't want to get too far ahead of us here because I do
Sure.
want to talk a little bit more about Los Angeles, and it's Los Angeles in the 80s,
Yes, it is.
right? Which I think makes it, a period piece, but not that far in the past that it's
Hmm.
completely like I remember the 80s. But
Right.
can you talk to us a little bit more about All Waters Are Graves, which, by the way, this might be one of my favorite titles for a book that I've
Oh,
seen
thank
this
you.
past year. It's just
It.
there's like a creepy sort of weight to it
Hmm.
that you're like, I don't know where this is going,
Yeah.
but it's interesting.
And it's actually the second title for the book. Originally, it was going to come out from a different publisher, well, i.e., not me,
Yeah.
back in 2020, and then 2021, then 2022, and I finally ended the process with them. I was going to be called My Drowning Chorus, which it kind of worked. It didn't. All Waters Are Graves, and I don't even remember how that came to me. I know I was doing revisions, and I think I was trying to work up ideas for the cover since I was going to do it myself. But yeah, so thank you for the compliment on the title. I wish I could tell you where it came from, but just kind of showed up. Um, so we want to talk about the book,
Yes,
or
absolutely.
okay? It's the second book in the series. The first one is The Queen of No Tomorrows, which in brief features a book forger named Kate McCready, who's also a librarian, ex punk rocker, kind of on the ratty side of things in early 80s Los Angeles. And she decides that she doesn't want to fake anybody else's books anymore. She wants to make one up and see if she can kind of sneak it in there as like newfound knowledge.
Mm.
And nobody's interested except for one person, the Queen of No Tomorrows, who is interested and knows about the book before she should know about the book. So, and it goes from there.
Nice. Now, with All Waters Are Graves, it's part of a series. Are these standalone? Is it
They're
one that you?
they're all I mean, they're standalone, although it'll get to a point pretty quickly where you won't be able to just jump in. I
Yeah.
mean, I'll try and do a précis at the beginning, a little. The way I look at it, I don't know if you've ever read All Star Superman, the Grant
Mhm.
Morrison and Frank Whiteley
I have
comic
it somewhere
series.
on my shelf here. Yeah.
Right. So the first page, though, is like the
Yeah.
4 panels that you need to know everything about Superman. So I try and do that with the characters. Now, granted, Superman's a giant mythic figure who can be done in broad strokes,
Yeah.
and these are a little more grounded characters. So it gets complicated, but I think I can get people basically up to speed. And so yeah, that may be working against me because who writes a horror series? Nobody does.
But
Occasionally you get a sequel years
yeah.
after, but not a series. So the second, but yes, they're all books that feed into a larger story, but each one you won't get to the end. It's like, okay, now you got to buy the next book to figure out what actually happens. It's like, no, you we'll get to a stopping point or a resting point, and then you can move on to the next book.
Yeah. Well, that's
And
great.
right now, sorry.
Oh no, I just was really interested in the whole process there.
Yeah. That's a tricky thing to balance too, because, and I think some of it honestly came out of reading serial comics when I was, a kid and an adolescent. It's like they used to write, now they write arcs that kind of lock together and maybe they form a bigger story. And, sometimes the continuity between from arc to arc is pretty hand wavy. But it used to be that you would have the same characters and follow, a years long, 2 years long, 3 years long story that would wind up in a big, and my platonic ideal of that was, Uncanny X-Men,
Mm.
which I read, I started reading in like the 140s, but I went back to as far as I could afford, which, it was easier then, although
Yeah.
I didn't make as much money now, as I do now. Um, yeah,
So those
because
were
now
like the
those
Claremont years
the
then.
Claremont, yeah, the Claremont Burn years, the Claremont
Yeah.
and Cockrum years, because they would weave in these long running storylines. It's like, oh, here's a little thing happening here, but we'll get back to that later. Here's the main story. So,
Yeah.
I'm making sure that the main story ends in every book, but there will be threads that continue on.
Yeah. Well, and I also, yeah, I loved the X-Men during that era, in part because I think Claremont was really good at, and I say this as a compliment, I felt he was really good at melodrama.
Hmm.
And when I was a kid, I
Yeah.
soaked it up and I didn't know what I was responding to. It's not till years
Hmm.
later as a writer that I go, oh, I was in it for the drama.
It's a soap opera.
Yeah.
It's a soap opera with people in costumes,
Mhm.
and that's fine. That's great. It was completely entertaining, and I was at the right age for it, and other people have what they have. Hopefully that they found what they needed at the right age, and but it's I can still read those stories, and yeah, there's rough spots, and there's places that I can see where editorial had a hand that wasn't ever intended, but that's one of the things that you have to live with on a job like that is it's not your stuff, whereas this is mine. For good or for ill, I get to control everything. So
Well, and speaking about controlling everything, you do have a Kickstarter going on right now.
hmm.
Now, the Kickstarter has reached its goal. It looked like it's
Right,
tripled its goal at this point.
it's almost tripled its goal. I had a $500, it's like, okay, I can make this, right?
Mhm.
There's enough people out there that will go into this, and it actually funded in the first day, which
Awesome.
was amazing.
Yeah.
I had no expectation. I thought we might scrape through at the end of the month. So we kind of plateaued. I think there was a plateau around 1,000, and then kind of it flattened out a little bit, and then we got up to 14, and it's stuck there for a while. And I'm completely happy with it because that is a far bigger response than I ever expected. And one of the interesting things is that there's an option to buy the first and second book, you
Hmm.
know, and a lot of people are going for that. So
Which
they
makes
want to,
sense.
yeah.
Well, that's great.
So,
Well, at the time that this video posts, there will be about 7 days left on the Kickstarter. I'll make sure to have a link down below so that people who
okay.
are curious about it can click on it and see. But yeah, the Kickstarter looks really great. I've, as an indie author, I've been very encouraged that there seems to be an audience of people on Kickstarter who are just looking for indie books.
Right. And that was one of the things that it took a long time for me because I'd seen a lot of comics projects and a lot of RPG projects and that
Yeah.
sort of thing, but I didn't see a lot of books. It seems like it's a much more expected thing there now, and maybe it has been for a while, and I just haven't seen it. It also took me for a while to even consider a Kickstarter, so because it seemed like there were some, I don't want to say moral hazards, but
Mhm.
I have seen some go badly. I participated in ones that have gone badly. So I wanted to make sure it was something that I could deliver on because I mean the book was already written and ready. I'm doing a final, a final edit right now, but with the miracle of, I guess it's, when you're doing a low run or print on demand, you can almost edit text on the fly.
Mhm.
But, but I'm doing a final edit now. So, and that should be ready for production probably in June.
Nice, nice. Yeah, that's well, and the graphic design on this looks really cool. Is this something that you did?
Yeah. If you're looking at the cover or the design on the Kickstarter site itself.
Design on the Kickstarter.
Yeah, those are all pieces taken from the first five covers for the books. The third one's written fundamentally. The fourth one is outlined. The fifth one's a collection of short stories, and I know what's going to be going in them, but I just haven't started them yet. So,
Yeah. Well,
but yeah, I did all those covers because end of last year, I had done one of them. I'd done one for Queen of No Tomorrows, which I re-released last year. And I was at a point where there's a bunch of stuff going on and I needed to do something, but I couldn't focus enough to write. So I just started grabbing art and planning out the pictures because it's a completely different side of the brain that I'm working with. And I can do it not I'm not really thinking about it consciously the same way I'm writing.
Mhm.
So um, I could do that while the other stuff was going on that I was, having to work through. So yeah, I ended up, I think, doing most of those in December, I think, last year. So I think I had one I had one before for All Waters, and I think I just basically scrapped it completely and started over with the cover concept that you see now. And actually, hold on a sec.
Yeah,
Real professional, right? I've done this
that's
before.
good. We're in the
So
moment.
there's it's reversed, but
Oh, that looks great.
there's the soft cover.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just did some proof copies to make sure that everything was working, and some people want to see copies, months ahead of time,
Mhm.
even though sending out print arcs is really expensive.
Well, and as a guy who's a fellow comic book guy here, I will say that I think the graphic design, it reminds me a little bit of like Vertigo's the DC Vertigo imprint. It has that kind of
Yep.
aesthetic to it.
That doesn't surprise me at all. Dave McKean is one of my all-time favorite
Nice.
artists. I've been lucky enough to, meet and talk with him at San Diego shows starting in like 1988 or 89.
Mhm.
So, when you could go over to the Alan Spiegel table where he was there with John Muth and Kent Williams, and, and they weren't being mobbed. So you could just sit down and talk with them for a while and look over artwork, which was amazing. But yeah, so yeah, I come by that honestly. The whole, a lot of the Vertigo, a lot of that look.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think I think well, I think people would be surprised to know just how many people came out of the comic book industry and came into fiction, prose fiction, writing. You look at people like Grant Morrison, but
Hmm.
there's so many others. I mean, even like a Michael Chabon or
Right.
Chip Kidd. I mean, there's a lot of people who I think have kind of made that leap over. For you, were there any particular challenges of moving from comics to prose? Uh, did you feel like it helped you in some ways?
It did. I started out as a prose writer actually. I
Okay.
wrote my first science fiction novel in 1991. I finally put it out after several revisions in like 2020 called Black Trace. Um, so I started in prose and had always written prose that, and back in the 90s, I was doing, submissions to a, whatever magazine would hold still long enough to, take submissions. I don't think I didn't place a single sale all through the 90s. So I walked away from it. Um, and I did animation. I did special effects right at the end of the 90s. And then my first child was born. So I was a stay-at-home dad. And I still wanted to do comics, so I put out Strange Ways I started it in 2003, I think, or four. Had a false start with a publishing company, and ended up putting it out myself in 2008, and the second one in 2012. Um, as for writing comics versus prose, when you're writing comics, you have a single unbreakable thing, unbreakable structural element that you can't overcome it. It's called the page. And you deliver comics one page at a time. The page can be as heavy or as light as you want to make it. But if you make a bunch of heavy pages, if all you do is heavy pages, then people are going to give up. They're not going to. So you have to, so you have to understand the rhythm and pacing of a single page as well as pacing out a whole story over 22 single pages,
Yeah.
or or 48, or however many you have. The first issue is never long enough. I mean, that's the first thing you learn if you've ever written comics. It's like, okay, you're starting from nothing, and you have to set the whole table in 22 pages and keep people interested and invested, when they turn that last page. And it's like, okay, well, I got to get the next issue now.
Yeah.
So which makes for some odd structuring, because we're used to hearing about the 3-act structure and that sort of thing. And in comics, every single issue is probably an act. It can even be 2 acts, but
Yeah.
usually it's just one,
Yeah. I also
particularly
found,
now.
yeah. I found while writing comics that I was working with a lot of indie comic book creators. So these were people who were still pretty early in their careers. And
Hmm.
I found myself always very worried about giving them something that artistically might be really hard for them to
Yeah.
recreate.
Yeah.
Like a busy scene in New York Times Square with hundreds of people
Yeah.
walking, I mean, they can do it, but that might be
Hmm.
the next month of their life while they're
Right.
cursing me out. Whereas when I'm writing prose, like I
Whatever you want
can,
to make. Yep.
yeah, if you can imagine it, like
Yeah.
I can write it.
Yep. People used to talk about, oh, comics are just movies with unlimited budgets. No, that's not
No.
exactly true because, the bulk of the work being done in a comic is being done by the artist,
Mhm.
and they are human like everybody else. And they have enthusiasm and drive. And you know what? You give them 30 impossible pages to draw, and by the end of it, they're going to want to be done for a while.
Yeah.
So, you have to balance that too.
Yeah. And
Um,
even if you have a lot of talking heads, like at a certain point, the reader's going to lose interest.
And there's only so many of Wally Wood's 22 panels that you can recycle through to make your talking heads sequence interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas you can have a conversation on in a book, go for quite some time because it's engaged on a completely different level, when the reader's consuming it and processing it and turning it into the work in their head. So yeah, there's and those are some big ones. Like I think I've if I flip through a comic now and there's like a 4-page conversation, it's like this isn't how you need to be doing this, my friend. You really should be considering what form you're working in,
Yeah.
because that's not doing it.
Well, and I will say to the credit of comic book writers who do go to prose or vice versa, I find that um, they tend to be more independently minded.
Hmm.
I feel like indie comics sort of took off before indie books really did. And maybe part of it
Yeah.
was the mystique. To be an indie comic book creator was kind of cool. I mean, no one was making money, but it
Yeah, nobody
was,
was making money, but there was, somewhere when lightning struck in the 80s, and then there
yeah,
was another one in the 90s,
yeah.
kind of small press explosions. But lots of people in indie comics are doing it because they love comics,
Mhm.
and that's great, but it's exhausting, you
Yeah.
know.
Oh, absolutely.
Um,
Well, and I know in the book publishing, it's taken a little while for the credibility to come around. Like there's using terms like vanity press or talking
yep.
about yeah,
I,
it's
I would argue that's still a process that's going on,
yeah.
honestly. Um, I thought for a long time that, okay, I have I'm with an indie publisher, and they've got some, they've had a string of successes of books that have, come out, and everything, everybody's gotten paid. And so they're able to, get attention from people doing coverage and that sort of thing. And I didn't find that that was necessarily the case.
Mhm.
um, I still think there's still, when you get to, and there's a difference between an independent author working with an indie publisher and an independent author who's doing it all themselves.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's still an uphill battle, honestly, because I think there is a whether it's conscious or unconscious, it's like, well, you couldn't get any publisher to bite on this. There's so many publishers out right now, and
Yeah.
they're all taking risks, and it just can't be that good, can it? I don't know. I mean, issues of good and bad are something left for individual readers, not,
Yeah.
uh, that's that's a different discussion.
Well, yeah, and I think that the idea that the publisher will take a risk on certain things, I find that some publishers will be very genre adverse.
Hmm.
That it's like, oh, well, no one's doing steampunk right now,
Well, that's, yeah. I
and
mean,
then nobody picks it up.
but then there's lots of, there's lots. I think there's still publishers who will basically, they're doing their one thing, and
Yeah.
that's, there's still somebody picking up steampunk, for instance.
Sure.
Now, whether or not it's selling in bookstores, if you can even get distribution for it, that's another thing entirely.
Yeah.
Because once, if I don't expect these books to make any real money past the Kickstarter. I'll be honest. I might sell some copies here and there. That's great. And hopefully people will like them. that's great too, or at least find them engaging. But this isn't, you know, this is not a money making proposition. So I think there's a lot of, structural barriers too. So and it's tricky because there's also a lot of publishers out, or a lot of people out there publishing their own work, and you just have a vast wide sea of people holding books over their heads saying, hey, pick me,
Mhm.
which is a good and bad thing. Anybody can do
A
it,
lot of noise. Yeah.
but there's a lot of noise and getting attention. And of course your book deserves more attention than these books over here. I mean, that's perfectly natural. So
Yeah. No, I could see that. Well, let's go back. I know that you are a West Coast guy.
yeah.
The story takes place in Los Angeles. Was there anything particular about Los Angeles that draws you to it as a character and as a setting? I think of like for me, it's like Elmore Leonard. Like I think of like
Hmm.
I tend to think of like the birthplace almost of like a West Coast noir, Chinatown, that
Right.
type. That's what I feel, even though I have family that lives on the West Coast. But
Yeah.
when the West Coast appears in literature, that's
Yeah.
where my brain tends to go. What is it
Right.
for you?
Well, I grew up like 50 miles from Los Angeles in Orange County. And my dad worked in Los Angeles most of my adolescent life. So I was up there, and it's a crazy place.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it's also because I watched a lot of movies and TV as a kid, and LA loves to portray itself. I mean, well, also, and I was watching at a time when a lot of media was being made in Los Angeles strictly because it kept the budget low.
Mm.
So I would see a lot of places, and and they were always interesting and weird. And yes, you'd see things like Century City, and you'd see the skyline, but then once in a while you'd see something shot downtown, and downtown LA. There is a downtown LA. It's along Broadway and like between Second and Eighth Street, and there's blocks down. There's that whole area down there. For a long time, it was a no man's land. It was no go territory in the end of the 70s, early 80s. So that, and sometimes people would just go and shoot it as it was. I'm thinking stuff like the Terminator, for instance,
Mhm.
the first one. That's shot in L.A. and Cameron did not dress it up. He did not dress it down either. He didn't really need to. Um, so yeah, I was always interested in the place itself, and I love it now because it is it's its own place. It's its own collection of places. There's 130 different neighborhoods. I'm blanking on the number, and I'm probably going to regret even having said that. But there are so many different small neighborhoods in LA. It's a giant patchwork that all connected, and all individual and unique, and strange and weird and beautiful and sometimes ugly. So it has a lot of character. It has a lot of texture. But I'm actually going to WonderCon in a couple weeks, and really looking forward to just going out and walking around and taking pictures, because there's always something to see there, and it's always going to be unique. So, but it's also, I mean, it's a huge place. I don't know if you said you have family out there?
Yeah, I have family that lives in Huntington Beach, and I've been
Oh,
up to
okay.
LA many times. I
Right.
remember going to visit some friends that they lived in the same apartment complex that Ayn Rand lived in. And that
Yeah.
kind of weird history, you're just like,
Hmm.
wait, Ayn Rand lived below where we are now? It's like, oh
Yeah.
yeah. And it's
Uh,
just it's just a regular apartment complex.
Yeah. Actually, I should say one of the big catalysts for that, for Weird LA and the history of LA in particular, was Mike Davis, and he wrote a book called City of Quartz I think I read it in 1991. And that just completely rearranged my head as to, how the city was made and what it was. And from there, I just started digging. So but it's always been a favorite subject. And no matter how I describe it, it's weirder and more lovely than that in person, and and more ugly. So it's more of everything. Then I try and do what I can to convey it, but I'm just me.
Well, and even if you are writing about real places, I think that you are still world building when you
Hmm.
write a city because it is your LA ultimately.
Right. And actually, that's another reason why I kind of picked the setting is I'm not, world building is exhausting. And I could do a whole podcast on, unpopular opinions about world building. Um, I think a lot of people end up substituting world building for character.
Yeah.
It's like the world should be a character, but it can't be the best character or the most
Mhm.
intriguing. But it certainly has to be there and have a life on the page. That and magic systems, yeah, I'll get myself in trouble and you in trouble by proxy, so I won't do it.
It can survive. Well, I see the counter. I'm running out of
Yeah.
time a little bit here, but before we go, um, let me ask this because when we talk about indie publishing, indie books, I really do believe that so much of it is not about convincing a person to read the book, but really about finding the right reader for your book.
Hmm.
So for you, who would your ideal reader be? Who are the people that, if they're listening to this right now, they're like, oh, that's me. I need to go get this book.
People who've been on the outside,
Mhm.
people who were, not the cool kids, but not in with the uncool kids, as it
Yeah.
were, the kind of in-betweeners. That was definitely me in high school. It's like, you had the metal kids and the punk kids out behind the bleachers smoking, and then the popular kids, and I'm kind of like drifting in between, sort of wandering around. Those people, that I think that's probably primarily it. I I have a hard time conceiving of a perfect reader
Mm.
or my target reader, which is probably why I have what readership in the tens or twelves. It's just not something that I've really thought about. I try to make them accessible for everybody, which some people would argue, well, that means nobody's going to love them. So um, I don't know. And it's probably going to be people who are, I guess, people who want to get a feel for things, but not read a history book.
Mm.
Now, how much of that actually happens, I don't know. Um, I think a lot of people are pretty content to figure, oh, the 80s are all chrome and neon and Miami Vice color schemes, and that's that, and we'll just that was the 80s. And it's like, well, it's not how I remember them, but
Yeah, yeah, particularly on the West Coast, it was not as much
no.
of the Miami Vice
No, there
aesthetic.
was, I mean, there was certainly some of it, especially
Yeah,
where I lived on the beach side of things. But
yeah,
yeah, it was still, a lot of it was, hung over from the 70s. So,
yeah. I feel yeah, just looking at the design, looking at the genre, it feels like, yeah, a story for someone who wants to kind of dip their toes into sort of this cross genre. Would it be fair to say kind of gritty and weird all at once?
yeah, I think it's probably somewhat gritty.
Yeah.
I try not to think about that part of it too much because when I say that, some people read, oh, this isn't gritty at all. It's like, well, James Elroy. Well, yeah, James Elroy is, Elroy is Elroy.
Yeah.
Nobody's gonna, I can't even try to be in the same category as him when it comes to something like
The
that.
grit factor's way
The
too
grit
high.
factor is, yeah, and the moral murk, and yeah. Um, so I think if you're interested in kind of a story that's not out to, I don't know, I never set out to break rules. I just like, okay, I know what the rules are, and I'm not so interested in, let's see if we can do something a little bit different. Let's see if we can, because I go through and I look at books and they offer these amazing conceits and concepts, and it's like, hey, this premise is really amazing, but I'm trusting that the author can deliver on this marketing hype in the back. And, you know, that's a tough sell, especially when, like you go through Netflix and, okay, wow, that's an amazing tagline. You get 5 minutes into the movie, it's like, okay, these people are never going to be able to deliver on half of what they're hoping for. So, um, yeah, it's tough. I don't know. Maybe I'm just, you know, pathologically averse to building up expectations, and it's like, oh, hey, does this sound interesting? Then give it a shot.
Yeah.
That's you know. Oh, hi, kitty cat.
Oh, there we go. We got a cat cameo.
We did get it. Well, she'd have to jump up.
Oh.
No, come here. Let's
Oh,
see if I
there you
can.
go.
Oh,
This
can I
is
get
what
you?
people want. They want to see the
Is this
cats.
what people want?
Oh yeah. Oh, it's so cute.
Okay, here we go. Yeah. Say hi, Mariah. Meow. Yeah.
Now, does she jump across the keyboard right while you're writing?
No, but she does jump in my lap if the oh, hold on, something's going on. If the heater's on, as it has been up until about 2 weeks ago, she'll jump into my lap because it's extra toasty. But
Yeah. Get bonus toasty.
yep,
Wonderful. Well, so Matt, if people want to find you online, where should they go?
highway62press.com, or I think it's on Blue Sky. I can't remember if it's Highway 62 Press, or why don't I check my profile? Highway 62 at .bsky.social.
Wonderful.
I still have a Twitter account. I posted there, I think, once after the Kickstarter started, but maybe twice. But I don't anticipate going back there anytime soon. I have an Instagram account I hardly ever use. So,
Yeah, I find that's a whole other conversation, but yeah,
oh
I
yeah,
find that social media is a drain all to itself.
yep.
Um, but yes,
Well,
sorry.
I was just saying a lot of people end up being very good at social media.
Yeah,
Does that mean they're getting good at writing?
not necessarily.
No, not always. It can happen. I mean,
Well,
somebody like Neil Gaiman is very good
oh,
at being Neil Gaiman on social media, and he can deliver writing. So that's, I guess he's the exception that proves the rule.
yeah, he has definitely kind of figured out his voice, I think, both as a human and as a writer.
Yeah,
So, well, I would recommend everyone check out the work of Matt Maxwell. You can go to the Kickstarter, which is still going on, and check it out because I think for a pretty good price, you can get some great books here. So, thank you, Matt, so much for joining
great.
us.
Thanks very much, David, for scheduling this, and thanks to everyone out there for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.